What seemed to be fundamental to the Egyptian in the act of writing is the gesture of graving. The image precedes writing in its function of encoding data, even after the invention of writing. Writing also means making the line speak, according to an epithet of the lunar god of intelligence and writing, Thoth. Another particularity of Egyptian hieroglyphic writing, which is of great importance in understanding the mechanism that led to its creation, is its iconic character, which has been very marked through its history. This approach makes it possible to show the depth of the conceptual anchoring of the relationship between image and writing, and makes it possible a posteriori to understand why hieroglyphic writing is so deeply rooted in its iconography and in particular in that of its formative periods. Indeed, from the end of the fourth millennium, a complex writing system using pictorial and phonetic signs and classifiers was developed and used in the Egyptian Nile Valley. Its continuity is known, since it was used until the Roman period, with a last inscription date from the 24 August 394 EC. What interests us here is its genesis, the context from which it originates, and the reasons that led to its development, bearing in mind that it did not originate from a head counting system, like the cuneiform script in Mesopotamia, nor from divinatory practices, like scapulomancy in China, nor from a calendar system, like some Mesoamerican scripts. Also, writing invention in Egypt is strongly linked to the management of surpluses and luxury imported product too. Already in the fourth millennium and in the periods that follow, the Egyptian Nile Valley was occupied by productive societies whose economy was based on agriculture, particularly cereals, and the breeding of herds of sheep, goats, and cattle. A culture was born at the beginning of the fourth millennium in the current region of the Nile Loop near Luxor, then was adopted through Upper Egypt, followed by Lower Egypt and the Delta, until at the end of the millennium, it included Lower Nubia and Near Eastern territories, such as the Gaza Strip, and a trading post in the Syro-Palestinian side. This is a culture known as Nakada, after the name of the necropolis where it was first identified at the end of the 19th century. Figurative and motivated hieroglyphic writing is rooted in the iconography of the millennium that preceded its emergence. At the end of the fourth millennium, the Nakadan culture is a society that makes abundant use of figuration of the image. Since the late Paleolithic, mainly animal representation have been engraved on rocks on the edge of the eastern desert. The round boss has existed in Egypt since the 5th millennium. In the Nagadan period, statuettes represent animals, but also women, some of whom wear bird masks. Some objects may have been engraved with motifs on their surface, such as vases, ostrich eggs, or palettes. The bas-relief appear a little later, during Nagada II. It concerns in particular the prestigious object of Nagada III, which will be mentioned below. Especially in Nagada I and early Nagada II, decorations were painted on vases, but also on some miraculously preserved linen textile and on some walls of a large tomb. The craftsman's technical mastery and the intrinsic beauty of the material can be an integral part of the image, as in the case of the stone vases, sometimes zoo or anthropomorphic, and the human figures as animal carved from a flint blade. It was at the end of the period at Nagada III that writing was invented, when images appear on a now varied number of supports using a wide range of techniques. Most specialists agree that the earliest hieroglyphic inscription consists of small tablets made of bone, ivory, or ebony, found near storage jars on the Yuji tomb of the Kab necropolis in Abydos. This tomb, discovered in 1988 by the team of the German archaeologist Günther Dreyer, belonged to King Scorpius III. It is dated to 3200 BC. It is to say, to the pre-pharaonic cultural phase of Nagada IIIA. The tomb of this king contained, among other things, about 3,000 liters of wine, according to the capacity of the jars. Vines were not yet cultivated in Egypt at that time. The region of production is the Palestinian area, in particular the Gaza Strip. One must therefore imagine this precious liquid brought back over hundreds of kilometers on the back of a donkey, with the problem of evaporation and breakage that one can imagine, to be finally deposited in a tomb and never consumed. The grave also contained large quantities of oil from the Nile Delta. The tables which are attached to the jars, square or rectangular, a few centimeters in size, are perforated in an upper corner and bear insigned on the flat surface from 1 to few signs. These can be divided into two categories: numerical signs, the first attestation of a mathematical recording system, and signs considered to be the first hieroglyphs. Their reading is still a matter of debate. At the time of their discovery, Günther Dreyer thought he was reading royal names, but other specialists favored toponyms, in particular the names of towns which contribute with their present tribute to the equipment of the royal tomb. Finally, Dreyer changed his interpretation and favored the reading of royal domain names, which also contribute to the royal equipment. The first incised inscriptions on these labels are very short, probably corresponding to only one word per support. Some of the signs already have the phonetic value that will be known later. Others are used as pictograms. The classifiers, signs which cannot be read, but which are placed at the end of a word to indicate to which category it belongs, are not yet present. They will appear 150 years later during the First Dynasty. A little less than 2,000 labels, both numerical and hieroglyphic, were found in the Yujit tomb. Their classification shows different categories of realia, which are the result of an intentional choice of the first writers. This includes a small number of male figures, wild animals of various species, plants, signs related to the environment and geography, sky, mountains, water sources, figures of building or landscape area, boats, possibly a chair, a sign understood by Günther Dreyer as a piece of clothing, and a number of signs that are not more difficult to interpret. Initially very succinct, the system was quickly expanded to a profusion of new signs. The 50 initial signs were doubled during the reign of the first two rulers of the First Dynasty, Narmer and Aa. But it is especially under the reigns of their successor, Jer and Jet, that new signs will be created. Thereafter, their number diminished, stabilized, and harmonised under the reign of Djoser at the beginning of the Third Dynasty. To sum up, we can say that in the early dynastic period, First and Second Dynasties, the corpus is about 900 signs, with a peak of more than 1,000 signs in the middle of the First Dynasty. It would be 1,500 to 2,000 signs at the end of the Old Kingdom. It is to say, the end of the third millennium. The question of whether the principle of writing was invented by an individual or a small group will probably never be answered. What the archaeological discoveries do show, however, is that the idea was very quickly adopted once it was launched. Hieroglyphic writing originated in Abydos, the royal residence. This map shows that in 150 years, this new tool has spread and been adopted in all the urban centers under the authority of the sovereign, implying a learning of the code in an increasingly wide circle. Writing became a consubstantial tool of royal power in the end of an administration coming from the dominant elite. The iconography of the first millennium is not the direct precursor of writing, yet it is deeply rooted in the Magadhan iconographic substratum. Continuity is not to be found in the catalogue of signs, but rather, initially, in the relationship of the sign to its support. In a first phase, the binomial composed of the sign and its three-dimensional support is unbreakable, as in the rune boss, when the sign is confused with the support. Next, a sign is put in place which is carried by the three-dimensional support, when the sign is painted, engraved, or applied to a vase or an ostrich egg. The first disjunction of the sign and the support has taken place. The three-dimensional object recites the sign, but is no longer confused with it. Relatively early on, another phase of the process is perceptible with a biplanar support that no longer uses the dips of the field. This is the case of tomb 100 in Hierakonpolis. The rupture is situated at this level, when the sign frees itself from the dips of the support and no longer fits into three-dimensional space. It is placed on a flat surface which is no longer significant by itself. The sign is no longer valid in relation to the supporting object, but for itself. The sign emerging as an independent component is a necessary prerequisite to writing. Such a radical change from the prevalent material to the sign predominance is certainly among the preconditions to a transition from graphic to proper writing. However, such a possibly bivalent, independent, or restrained sign also reflects the deep roots origins of the hieroglyphic writing in iconography. Iconographic tradition, scheme, and writing have the same roots, like two separate branches springing from one stem. Among the causes of such a continuous interlinkage between writing and images is that hieroglyphics have never broken with the traditional rules of realistic representation, as presumed. For instance, the drawing of a hoe is recognizable as a hoe, even though the sign is used to express the verb see, based on its phonetic value. We will now focus on the choices made for stylization of representation, the representation convention, and the constitution of a catalogue based on the categories of the real. For this purpose, we need to take into account one particular support of images called decorated ware or D-ware that represents a short moment of iconographic Magadhan production. They appear at the end of Nagada 2b, it is to say 3650 BC, and disappear at the end of Nagada 2d2, more or less 3400 BC. They are objects of modest dimensions, about 15 centimeters high. At the present time, a corpus of almost 500 objects is available. Most of them come from a funerary context. A few were found during excavation of residential structures. The decoration consists of signs arranged one after the other from different categories: men and women, different wild animal species, such as small desert cattle, canids, birds, especially ostriches, reptiles, and saurians, few fishes, the dog as the only domestic animal, plants, there are generally unidentifiable geographical elements, mountain, point, and watercourses, and artifacts, boats, weapons, flight animal skin stretched over sticks, and a number of unidentified elements. These elements are composed in scene according to strict rules of association and avoidance. The scenes give no indication of the way or environment in which people of Nagada lived, their social structures, nor their production activities. Some scenes evoke biotope or activities such as navigation or hunting. Above all, they seem to function by evoking contemporary ritual practices. The impression of familiarity or continuity between the predynastic iconography elements and the writing scene is due primarily to the concordance of choice in the way the items are schematized between the sign of the deware and those of the pyramid text at the end of the third millennium. In order to make an object unequivocally identifiable at first glance, the same choices were made between front or side view and the determination of the most characteristic elements that allow recognition, such as the horn that distinguish the different species of gazelle or antelope, the wearing of the tail raised or folded back to recognize a dog from a wild canid. It regularly appears that the inside of the body of Nagadan mammals, especially hippopotamuses and cattle, may have been represented hatchet or with some other type of filing with no relation to the rendering of the coat or skin. This is absolutely no longer common in the Old Kingdom. The inside of the body is then left empty, whereas the bulge of the animal's shoulder or thick is marked in a very conventional way. Thus, content search of legibility is perceptible in the improvement of the system over times. Thus, there is still a problem with the reading of the sign corresponding to either the lizard or the crocodile in the Nagadan period. This possible confusion is ancient, since it is already present in the rock art of the Eastern Desert in the Epipaleolithic times. In fact, seen from a bird eye's point of view, the animal remains ambiguous. From the Old Kingdom onwards, the lizard continues to be seen from the top with a curved tail, when the crocodile is seen in profile, which better highlights its formidable jaw. And it is indeed with the animal representation that one finds the most continuities. 16 animals from the list of signs established for the deware can be found among the determining signs of the text of the pyramids. These belong to all order, mammals, birds, fish, reptiles, and saurian, without forgetting the scorpio. A number of categories of realia appear in the text of the pyramid, which had never been represented in the predynastic period. Also, it can be taken for granted that these objects or commodities existed in the fourth millennium. Some of them are archaeologically documented, such as ceramic containers or basketry, textile, ropes, ornamental objects. Others correspond to technical development of the third millennium, such as the tool used in stone architecture. Elements of architecture made of perennial materials also make their appearance, such as the monumental tomb, the door, or the staircase. It should be remembered that this systematic use of stone in funerary architecture dates back to Djoser complex in Saqqara at the beginning of the third dynasty. Among the animals, we see the appearance of insects. Domestic animals, very discreet until now, take a new importance, at least in their iconographic investment. The regalia and the jewelry representation appear in the text of the pyramid, as do the knives and piriform macades. These objects were represented on the power fact, palette, knife handle, macade, and so on, of Nagada III, but not on the deware. The major event is the appearance of categories unknown until then, which introduce the objects of everyday life as well as food preparation. Among these are those used in agricultural activities, such as tools, those used or produced by craftsmen, firework, woodworking, weaving, pottery, basketry. Food preparation are often placed in their container using synecdoche process, the jar mining beer or wine, depending on the shop, the globular pot honey. They are both solid and liquid foods, with the development of the two bases of the pharaonic diet, bread and beer. Clothes, mats and ropes, domestic furnishings are there and also part of the funeral equipment. In Nagadan period, only flayed and properly tanned animal skin was depicted, not for its practical uses, but for its role in regeneration rituals. A whole villaged world emerged in the Old Kingdom, with the house, the irrigated land, but also the night sky with its star and the moon. In other words, a world closer than that of Nagada II. It is also a more everyday, cyclical world, and not just the emergence of a few silent phenomena, also not located in space or time. An equally interesting phenomenon is the appearance of truncated signs, part of human or animal bodies, to neutralize by magic their possibly dangerous character. This indicates to us a different efficient charge of the sign, able by itself of malicious action or will. In other words, the writing sign is now attributed with an intentionality that did not seem to benefit the graphic sign at Nagada II. In Mesopotamia, as in Egypt, the need for accounting linked to the development of an administrative system at the service of centralized power has often been put at the heart of the motivation for creation of writing. However, the accounting necessity as such does not require the creation of a writing. Other recording systems can be considered. A certain number of them exist before the creation of writing, and the later does not make them disappear immediately. The first medium I will present to you is a cylinder seal. It is not an Egyptian invention. It was introduced from Mesopotamia at the end of Nagada II, around 3400 BC, before the creation of writing system. The oldest attestation bear incise motif of Mesopotamian inspiration, with the motif of the master of animals in particular. The Egyptian quickly reappropriate its iconography and replace the Mesopotamian themes with their own. These objects are used to mark container, jar, basket, boxes, and to affix the mark of their owner while making sure that they have not been opened. Soon after the invention of writing, seals will become a medium for writing, mentioning in particular the owner of the good and their nature. Another way of marking the container of preserved foodstuff is to make an incision on the belly or neck of the jar before cooking. Of course, this marking remains fixed regardless of the content of the jar. Such signs have existed in Egypt on ceramics since Nagada I, around 3900. They have become known as pot marks. The use of pot marks remains sporadic from Nagada I to the beginning of Nagada III. However, their number increased significantly during Dynasty 0 and 1, with the greatest number of pot marks being found during the second half of Dynasty I. After that, they decrease quickly until disappear. Like the plaquette of the Uji tomb, the pot marks consist of 1 to 4 signs, only 2 signs in more than half of the cases. It is not yet possible to understand what indications the pot marks gave. As far as we know at present, we can only specify what they do not note. It is to say, contents, nor quality of the foodstuff, nor provenance, nor the owner. Ink marks are made on the neck or belly of the storage jars, like pot marks, but after the ceramic has been filed. They appear at about the same time as the writing, are used a lot until the end of the Third Dynasty, and more sporadically during the rest of the Old Kingdom. The Yuji tomb contained both engraved tables and ink inscription on jar. The two sets must be distinguished not only because of the nature of the support or the inscription technique, but also because of the sign depicted. In fact, the record of the sign draw on these two types of registration shows strong disparities. A certain number of signs traced in ink do not exist on the tables and vice versa. And above all, these inscriptions are not the prototypes of hieroglyphic known later. Some of the signs exist only as mark in ink and not on other medium. This led researcher Ilona Regulski to consider ink marks as an independent and autonomous category of graphic media. For her, ink marks are not writing. The three systems we have just presented can therefore be considered as markings or registration, but not as writing. What kind of information is given by the first inscription? What does writing note at the beginning? The jar labels are probably not support for narration or ritual discourse. The first inscriptions do not reflect the fluidity of the discourse. They only show a few signs each time. They only give some punctual and practical information, content, provenance, honor, quality. Nevertheless, they allow the information transmitted to be stabilized. However, Pascal Vernus rightly pointed out that these labels are certainly not linked to a single trivial administrative context. Why then a prestigious and perennial support, such as ebony, bone, ivory, or wood, from which the labels are made? Why so much care in their manufacture? The labels come from the offering chambers of the king tomb, and the architecture and the wealth of the funerary material allow us to imagine from such a high age the complexity and ostentation of the royal funerary rituals. Our information on the ritual performance practices on such occasion remains too tenuous and indirect. The label must memorize by means of this new data encoding system, still experimental, that such and such a locality or foundation in Egyptian Hut, the domain, contribute to the equipment of the tomb. Writing is a recording and perpetuation of a presence and a gift. The first written inscriptions are marks of vassalage and loyalty of the companion around the royal person. Accompanying persons give their name and the price they have to pay through a more or less voluntary contribution to the funeral equipment. The question asked by this workshop is, how does the image become a sign? In order to try to provide an answer to this problem that it's possible with the material and culture presented here, we will begin by summarizing the process as it has been outlined in the previous development. The first step is a modification of the relationship of the image to its graphic support, freeing it from it. If the sign is an autonomous unit, the image is not. Next comes the normalization of the mode of representation of the image by creating convention of representation in order to give the sign an univocal meaning. Furthermore, Pascal Vernus distinguished three criteria which mark a difference in status between image and writing signs. This is essentially due to the linearity of the language encoded by the writing signs and is characterized by three properties, which are: first, orientation. The non-symmetrical signs are all turned in the same direction, generally that of the starting point of reading. 2. The rectilinear investment of space. The signs follow one another in horizontal or vertical lines or columns, most often materialized by a line and closely delimiting the space devoid to writing. 3. Calibration. Within the lines of column, the mutual proportion of the writing sign depend on their distribution in ideal units, the quadra. Finally, the third step in the integration of the information carried by the sign into a complex system of reference. In Egypt, the sign becomes a medium of information and memory and is used in a context of ritual enunciation. This is how the phonic and phonetic dimension of the writing sign come into play, which Andreas Toder will discuss tomorrow. It has also been enlightened by the work of Pierre Deléage that the passage from image to a sign implies bonding to it to a phonetic content and to a ritual discourse by accompanying, learning, and guiding its recitation. The three transformations that the image must undergo in order to become a sign thus relate to its autonomy, monosemy, and integration. Because I am dealing here more particularly with the graphic aspect of the sign, and in the Egyptian context of the transition between so-called prehistoric and pharaonic cultures, we will insist on the fact that the image does not cease to be iconic as long as it becomes a sign of writing. The image in Egypt becomes a sign when it allows several levels of signifiers to be superimposed and intertwined, whether intentional or more or less unconscious. Not only do they convey information, but also a vision of the world. Image-based writing has enabled cultural agents to impose a standardization and a vision of the world through the deployment of an infrastructure like administration, through the construction of complexes that are most often closed and inaccessible, the palaces, through the use of grandiose landscape designed to create and magnify a mystery around power, like at the royal necropolises, but also through the scriptural system itself. This dimension was highlighted by Orly Goldwasser. She wrote, "The Egyptian intelligentsia had a powerful interest in perpetuating iconic writing, which had become a precious asset on the Egyptian cultural market. Superb young Egyptian aristocrats are always portrayed in a context of prosperity and happiness. The ideal Egyptian life of the elite is constantly represented and perpetuated. The old, the infirm, and there were certainly mainly, including Hatshepsut and Ramses II themselves, the obese, the Maymen have no place in this ideal graphic representation of the world. The example given by this researcher with one of the most common signs of the Egyptian system, that of the crouching man, is worthy. The verbal signifier man carry a general meaning such as male human being. The Egyptian grapheme for the general term, such S in man in Egyptian language, on other hand, always show a young, tawny, lean Egyptian male in a seated position with short hair and a brief white skirt. These details identify him immediately in ethnic, aesthetic, and sociological terms. The time, which has almost identical intertextual references in the pictorial representation of the time, in particular in numerous scenic representation in Old Kingdom tombs, represents the prototypical Egyptian male as conceptualized by the culture agent. In conclusion, we can say that the Egyptian writing system therefore appears as a multiscalar receptacle of superimposed signifiers in each sign, offering a complexity of reading levels never before approached. Thank you for your attention.